What would you be afraid of if, God forbid, you went to prison? Most of us think of prisons as dangerous places, but often when we imagine the dangers, we picture dangerous or unstable individuals, predators looking to dominate the weak and take down the strong. Thankfully, every time I've gone to prison, it's been as a volunteer legal advocate, not as a prisoner. I volunteer with an organization called the California Coalition for Women Prisoners that supports people of all genders in California's women's prisons. The people I meet with are rarely scared of each other. They're afraid for their lives because trying to live in prison can be fatal. Prison is especially dangerous if you're elderly or ill. It's dangerous because healthcare in prisons is bad, and being in prison is bad for your health. Healthcare in California's prisons is so bad that in the case Brown versus Plata, federal courts ruled that California's prison system's healthcare violates the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. In other words, the judges ruled that California's prison's healthcare is in the same category as torture. Now, while some of the overcrowding that led to that reality has been reduced over the last few years, California prisons are still a horrible place for healthcare. In our prisons, healthy people get sick, and sick people get sicker. Let me tell you a little bit about my friend, Denise. Denise is 65 years old, legally blind, Black woman, and she's been in prison since 1999, more than 20 years. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. And if her sentence is carried out, she'll die in prison, and that may be very soon. She's been in prison in the California Institution for Women. Denise has so far survived multiple bouts of metastatic breast, liver, and ovarian cancer. 2 weeks ago, she received another bad cancer diagnosis. She's now receiving chemotherapy in prison. But even her prison doctor agrees that living in prison is making her condition worse and making it less likely that she will be able to beat the cancer this time around. Who does it serve for us to keep people like Denise in prison? When a person is sentenced to a life without parole or LWOP sentence, the idea is that they will serve the rest of their natural life in prison without any chance of getting out. But there's an inherent contradiction. Life in prison can never be natural. Stress, tension, neglect, exploitation, racism, lack of health care are all parts of living in prison. They kill. That's why I think it's fair to say that life without parole and other extreme sentences are actually death sentences. Of course, because our system does not always serve justice, we know that some people are serving time, a lot of time, for crimes they did not commit. Denise, too, maintains her innocence. But what of the guilty, you might ask? Don't they deserve whatever they get? Many of us may make judgments about people in prison based on the crime for which they were convicted, and we may tend to rationalize whatever happens to them in prison as a consequence of their own actions. But for me, when something feels like it's just common sense, I want to stop and be critical. Why do we feel this way? Whose interests are served by me feeling, believing, or thinking that they deserve what they get? I hope that you agree with me when I say that it's especially in these situations when we can and should ask, is this right? Is this just? Is this humane? And if it's not, let's change it. We don't have to let ourselves be prisoners of the status quo, if the status quo means giving up our sense of compassion, mercy, and human decency. The tough on crime mentality and policies that have led to so many people like Denise serving 20 years or more in prison really began in the 1980s. Before that, far fewer were in U.S. prisons, and far fewer were serving extreme long sentences, even for violent crimes. Many experts now recognize that those tough on crime policies were racist and led to the current situation in the United States. Mass incarceration, huge numbers of people serving extreme sentences, and a very large population of elderly and ill prisoners. In California, prisoners over 50 years old are about 25% of the entire prison population. Many of these people have served 2 or more decades in prison. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 200,000 people aged 55 and older are incarcerated in the United States. And of these, Black, Latino, Native American, and poor people make up a disproportionate number. Recently, reforms have focused on alternatives to jails and prisons, lesser punishment for drug and nonviolent offenders, in recognition of how overcrowded and extreme our prison system has become. But not as much attention has been paid to those like Denise, serving very long sentences for violent crimes. But we should recognize that long prison sentences are relatively unique to the United States. The United States is one of few major countries to sentence people to life without parole. In fact, in many European and Latin American countries, life sentences are unheard of or not even allowed. In fact, in many countries, 20 years is the longest a judge can sentence anyone before that person becomes eligible for release. The mass shooter, Anders Breivik in Norway, who killed 77 people in one day about 4 or 5 years ago, received the maximum sentence possible in Norway, 21 years in prison. Meanwhile, there are thousands of people in the United States serving sentences longer for nonviolent crimes. I think it's time for us to rethink what it means to lock people up and throw away the key. What are the costs to our own dignities, our society, when we fail to have a thoughtful and merciful approach to treating those who have trespassed against us? Regardless of our individual or even cultural attitudes towards crime and punishment, there are some universal standards which nations around the world, including the United States, have agreed to in principle, if not in practice. Let me share 3 of those principles with you. They come from the Basic Principles for the Treatment of Prisoners, which was adopted and proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in December of 1990. The first is, all prisoners shall be treated with the respect due to their inherent dignity and value as human beings. Number 2, prisoners shall have access to the health services available in the country without discrimination on the grounds of their legal situation. And 3, with the participation and help of the community and social institutions, and with due regard to the interests of victims, favorable conditions shall be created for the reintegration of the ex-prisoner into society under the best possible conditions. So I ask about Denise. Does receiving chemotherapy in a prison setting, isolated from family and friends, including her 6 children and 3 grandchildren, during a global pandemic, does that respect her inherent dignity and value as a human being? Can Denise access in prison the full range of medical treatment and holistic support that would enhance her chances of surviving this bout of cancer and that might be available to her if she was outside of prison? And third, will everyday people find it in themselves to support the reintegration of people like Denise back into our communities? Denise has never had a chance to hug her 3 grandchildren, who are still quite young. But she shows me pictures of them whenever I visit her. When I sit across that table from her in the legal visiting cafeteria at CIW, I see a sweet, bright, sick, elderly woman who just wants to breathe free before she dies, who just wants to hold her grandchildren before she dies. And I wonder, what do we get? How do we benefit as a society by keeping Denise and people like her in prison? Can we really believe that it makes society safer? How much of our own sense of mercy and compassion must we give up because we owe it to the victims. There are some things we can do now. Many organizations and individuals are currently mobilizing an online campaign to pressure local, state, and national leaders to free elderly and sick prisoners during this coronavirus pandemic. We can add our names and support to petitions and Twitter storms. We can also advocate that governors and parole boards at the state level approve more prisoner applications for commutations, clemencies, and compassionate release for the ill and the elderly. Thank you to Governor Newsom, who commuted 27 sentences of people in prison this past Friday, including for some who'd been convicted of murder. We can also continue to learn, think, and dialogue about what it means to respect the dignity of those in prison, and whether in the United States we can hold faithfully to the values of both justice and mercy. Thank you.